Chapter 2. Dylan Wycliffe made sure the family was up and moving after sunrise. Today would be a long day, and he wanted an early start. Vernon grumbled a bit, but grabbed his electronic game and soon was ready to go. Holly, he noted with surprise, actually had a bit of a smile on her lips instead of looking so sad and tired as she had the previous days. Perhaps she was finally adjusting to the idea of a new school. It wasn't so bad, moving to a new school. He'd done it. Breakfast went rather smoothly. Holly turned a bit pale when the bacon was brought out, but managed to finish her oatmeal and leave the table without incident. Dylan hated that Holly had become a vegetarian, but Cousin Harry had been right when he said it wasn't something Holly could overcome with a bit of hunger. A healthy Holly was better than some pieces of meat, but it shouldn't have had to happen in the first place. The family piled into the auto. Glancing behind him to make sure everyone was ready, Dylan could see that Vernon had settled comfortably in his seat and was already actively working on the controls, playing some game. Holly was staring glumly out the window while absently stroking her gray cat that lay curled contentedly on her lap. Dylan started the car and turned onto the main road. Today, however, Dylan was looking for something not marked on Laurel's route, someplace he wanted to visit first. They had driven about an hour when Dylan spotted something familiar. He made a right-hand turn and started down a new road. "That's not the way to the school," Laurel commented. "I know," Dylan replied. "There's something I wanted to see as long as we were out this way. It won't take too long," he added. "Just a quick side trip into Little Winging." Thankfully, Laurel didn't ask more questions. Dylan didn't think he could really explain. They would all find out soon enough. At first, Dylan thought he might have made a mistake in his turns. He should have checked the map instead of relying on half-forgotten memories. But then, as the auto turned down Magnolia Road, he recognized a child's play park. Then he turned onto Magnolia Crescent, which he also recognized. Finally, he saw what he was looking for. A street sign labeled Privet Drive. Driving a bit further, he pulled his auto to a stop and parked on the sidewalk next to a familiar-looking two-story house with an old brass number 4 hanging from the door. Privet Drive was filled with large square houses with perfectly manicured lawns, except for the house at number 4. The house and grounds at number 4 Privet Drive stuck out like a sore thumb. Sections of the low rock wall that surrounded the lawn had crumbled and needed repair. The lawn was filled with tall weeds, dry patches, twigs, and leaves. It looked as if it hadn't been mowed in years. A hydrangea bush planted near the house had grown to gigantic proportions and completely covered the front window. "This it?" asked Laurel curiously, looking at the house. "Yeah," replied Dylan, as the memories washed over him. "Why are we here?" asked Holly from the back seat, following his gaze and looking at the house also. "This is where I grew up," Dylan answered simply. Dylan got out of the auto. The place was clearly unoccupied. There was surely no harm in having a closer look. Everyone else followed suit, getting out also, taking the opportunity to stretch after being in the car for so long. The cat leaped lightly over the rock wall and soon vanished within the tall grass and weeds. "My parents would have had a fit seeing it this way," commented Dylan to no one in particular, remembering the neatly manicured yard and lawn of many years ago. Appearances were very important to them. Dylan walked along the rock wall, turning at the opening. He started down the sidewalk leading to the front door. The path itself was no longer visible, obscured by a mat of leaves, fallen branches, and weeds, but Dylan knew where it should have been. His feet crunched loudly on the leaves with every step. Holly and Laurel followed. Vernon gave one cursory look at the house and instead made his way to a fat, shady tree on the sidewalk near the car. He plopped down comfortably in the shade while leaning his back against the tree and resumed his game. While in the middle of the yard, halfway to the house, Dylan stopped and surveyed the house as a whole. The place actually looked pretty good, considering its age and disuse. The paint was chipping, but it did not appear to have suffered obvious damage through time or vandalism. Its roof, windows, and doors all looked intact. "The last time I saw this place," he said softly, "was over 20 years ago." Dylan had never talked about that night or the times after to anyone. Who would have believed him if he had? Dylan always felt bad about not telling Laurel, but he couldn't. The family was supposed to be in hiding. A wrong word could betray them to Harry's enemies. Worse, to speak of any of it meant acknowledging Dylan's relation to that kind of person. But Laurel knew about Harry now, and the danger from Lord Voldemort no longer existed. Dylan felt the need to tell Laurel more. I was in our car seated next to these two very strange, leading away to someplace, I don't know where, because somebody was chasing after Harry, began Dylan. At the time, I think I was more scared of those, people sitting next to me than anything else. They said it might be a while, but nobody would say for how long. Probably nobody knew for sure, but I don't think anybody thought it would be for as long as it was. I certainly didn't. I always planned to return, he added while moving forward. That's why I have this. Dylan pulled out a set of house keys and separated out a single key that he carried with him every day since the move. We drove down the road, Dylan continued, inserting the key in the lock, until it got darker. Then they had Dad stop the car and they did something to us. Dylan twisted the key in the lock, shivering reflectively as he remembered. And nothing was ever the same again. The door creaked and groaned on its hinges and slowly swung open as Dylan pushed. Dylan closed his eyes, remembering. We were in a new place with new names, he continued, not moving from the opened door, uncertain of what he would find within. Dad had a bank account in his new name with a very generous balance in it. Dylan remembered how Dad had grumbled at the time that it wasn't nearly as much as it should be, given all the problems their lot had caused his family, especially considering all the trouble that they had gone to in raising Harry. But looking back, Dylan realized it had been more than enough to start over. Dad had a new job waiting for him, where everyone appreciated his knowledge and expertise, he continued aloud, telling Laurel. Our lovely new furnished house was in the kind of neighborhood Mum always liked, and she fit right in. And me, well, I had an empty bedroom to fill with new stuff. Dylan stepped into the house, closely followed by Laurel and Holly. A layer of dust had settled undisturbed on the floor. An equally thick layer of dust lay on the couch, chairs, and furnishings the family had left behind. Otherwise, the place looked just as Dylan remembered it. Knick-knacks on the shelves, the tube, magazines on the end table, everything had a thick layer of dust on it, but otherwise looked as it had more than 20 years earlier. Laurel and Holly spread out looking around, but not touching the things they saw in the dusty room. A 20-plus-year-old television guide, a bowl of Dad's favorite candies covered in dust, an ancient magazine on the end table announcing the collapse of a bridge. Dad was sure Cousin Harry planned to take the property for his own, but it was plain that Cousin Harry had never returned. No one had. Dylan wondered vaguely why the place had never been broken into or vandalized, but shoved the thought aside to continue his story. I never liked Harry, he said as he stepped carefully around the room. Dylan recognized and remembered the various dusty items he saw all in their original places, and I grew to hate him even more after a while. Dylan considered exploring the whole house, but decided against it with Holly and Laurel nearby. There would be things he didn't really want them to see, didn't want to try to explain. A door under the stairs with locks outside, and another one upstairs with a cat flap. They made sense at the time, but now, with a family of his own, he wasn't so sure. You see, he explained, I lost everything because of him. My name, my things, my friends. I couldn't even return to finish school at Smeltings because someone might have known. Dylan looked down at Holly. They didn't think to provide me with transcripts, he added bitterly. I had to finish my education at someplace new, where completed transcripts weren't so important. I had to take all sorts of extra exams to prove I was qualified to receive a diploma. Dylan fell silent. Those were times he didn't like to remember. They were too horrible. And then I met you, he said to Laurel, walking over to her and drawing her close. Somehow you made everything all right again. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, he added, hugging her tight. I don't expect I'd have ever met you If we hadn't gone into hiding and changed our names, Dylan added, burying his face in Laurel's hair as she hugged him back. But those first years were awful. I wanted to tell you all about this hundreds of times, Dylan continued, but I couldn't. You'd have thought me crazy, and I couldn't prove any of it. Also, he said softly, I was ashamed. Ashamed at having to go into hiding. Ashamed at being related to people like that. Dylan renewed his hug, holding Laurel even tighter, unwilling to let go. I can't even say my own name, he confessed in a whisper. Not my real one, that is. You can say it. Harry can say it. But not me. Not even now. Believe me, I've tried. I can't say it, and as for writing it, Dylan shuddered, remembering the last time that he had written his original name. The right hand wouldn't cooperate, but he'd managed to get his left hand to do it. It's possible, but not easy, he said simply. I think they thought we might slip up in our new lives, so they fixed it so we wouldn't. I never asked, but I'm sure Mum and Dad are the same way. Dylan loosened his hug. He moved his arms up to her shoulders, holding them very gently, and looked earnestly in Laurel's emerald green eyes, her beautiful green eyes. I was afraid we couldn't even name our boy Vernon because of that. Because, you see, that's Dad's name, too. Dad's real name. You mentioned once how you noticed Dad never called Vernon by name. I don't think it's a weird quirk. I just don't think Dad can say his own name, even when it belongs to someone else. Dylan looked down. I used to hate Harry for that, too, he confessed. But not now. Dylan raised his head and scanned the living room with all its dust and forgotten memories. Looking about this room, he began, I realized that name belonged to a different person, a different life. I'm not that person anymore, so I don't need that name. I'm Dylan Wycliffe now, with a wonderful wife and 2 terrific children, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. Dylan felt a small hand take hold of his. He looked down and saw Holly standing next to them. I realize how hard this has been for you, he told her, changing the subject. Believe me, I know. And I appreciate that you haven't fought me, he continued. I know you like those people, and some of them may actually be nice. But all of them, even Cousin Harry, are very dangerous, he told her sternly. I will never feel at ease until you are as far away from them as possible, safe in another school. Holly didn't answer, but she wrapped her arms around both Dylan and Laurel in a tight hug. Laurel and Dylan responded by enfolding Holly in their arms, making it a group hug. It was the first time Holly had hugged Dylan since the station. It was a start. Maybe she'd truly forgive him someday. Come on, said Dylan after they finished their hug. Let's get out of here. We've a long way to go. And he gently guided the 2 out of the house with an arm on each of their waists, releasing Laurel only briefly to close the door. The 3 of them stepped together into the warm sunlight and headed towards the car. Dylan didn't bother to look back. The house was nothing to him anymore. Holly Wycliffe could feel the anti-stranger wards surrounding the house the moment she got out of the car to stretch. The wards felt old and musty, but still quite strong. She and Mum would have soon lost interest in the place, as Vernon had. But they were standing next to Dad. Dad wasn't a stranger. He belonged there. Staying close to Dad enabled them to bypass the wards protecting the house. It was as if Dad had invited them within, making them strangers no more. Holly found the house with its dusty relics creepy. There was no warmth or happiness within its walls. She didn't need to be an empath to feel the intense emotions coming from Dad as he spoke. He practically radiated anger, frustration, and grief. Plainly, his experiences after leaving this house were not good. Holly could see why Dad blamed Cousin Harry, though, for their own safety, Harry had been kept ignorant of anything concerning Dad and his family. Holly didn't doubt Dad's sincerity when he spoke to her about the wizards either. She disagreed, of course, but while he spoke, Holly realized Dad still loved her more than anything, and no matter what, she still loved him. Holly wished she knew more about medicine and people so she could help ease the pain she felt coming so strongly from Dad. A squeeze with her hand and a hug was all she could think of to do. It wasn't much, but surprisingly, it seemed to help. Dad felt much better when he decided to leave the house. His spirits rose considerably, and Holly's along with him when they stepped off the porch and into the sunlight. This house of Dad's youth seemed an unhappy place. Holly much preferred the here and now. "Hey!" came a shout from Vernon from across the way. "There's something in this tree. It looks like it's been here a while. Did you guys put something here?" "Not us," came Dad's easy shout back. "Dad didn't hold for stuff like that." Vernon began pounding on the tree trunk. "I don't think you should do that, Vernon," called Mom. "Don't worry," he shouted back. "I'm not hurting anything. I'm just breaking off some chunks of bark that grew over this." Vernon gave a few more thunks on the tree. "Ha!" he shouted jubilantly. "You may not have, Dad, but Cousin Harry sure did. It's his name here." "Can't be," responded Dad promptly. "He wouldn't have dared. I'd have known." "Well, he must have pulled one over on you," responded Vernon excitedly as he continued working, "because it says Harry Potter and some girl." Vernon said the last part in a sing-songy voice, the kind one used to tease another about boy-girl relations. He continued to pound on the tree. "There was no girl," said Dad flatly. Holly looked from her dad to Vernon at the tree with a growing sense of apprehension. She couldn't see much of anything because Vernon stood in front of the tree with his back to them. His body covered both the object of his interest and his efforts, but there was no doubt in Vernon's mind about what he had found. There was also no doubt in Dad's mind about Harry's life here, and no girl. Cousin Harry wasn't the kind of person to scratch romantic messages in trees anyway. What else could it be? This didn't feel right, not at all. Holly broke free of Dad's grip and quickened her pace to see what Vernon was doing. The pounding stopped, and Vernon's voice came through loud and clear, his voice puzzled. "But who's Tom No!" screamed Holly, running forward. "Don't touch it!" But her words came too late. Even as she spoke, Holly watched Vernon start to fade and then vanish from sight. The earth seemed to give a mighty heave with a loud rumble like thunder. Daylight flickered out and on again, repeating and continuing so quickly the effect was like strobe lights. The Wycliffe car disappeared. Other cars and people appeared and disappeared on the roads and sidewalks with blinding speed. The grass beside the tree began to shrivel and shrink to nothing, growing moments later at incredible speeds, but Holly didn't notice. She continued on her run forward, all the while screaming, "No!" leaping over the low rock wall and skidding to a stop in front of the huge tree where she had last seen Vernon. The tree was changing, too. Its leaves were shrinking and growing over and over again at a rapid rate. The trunk seemed to get skinnier and skinnier. Interlude into the past. One fateful day, 26 years earlier. Tom Riddle bent down and picked up the broken glasses and placed them carefully in his pocket. They would do Harry Potter no good, and it would make a nice memento of this day, as would Potter's wand that he now carried. Tom looked down with satisfaction at the wand. It had a surprisingly familiar feel about it. Dumbledore would probably recognize the wand when he saw it, but the knowledge would do him no good. By then, the boy who lived would have become a mere memory. Tom looked up at the basilisk that was now swallowing the last bits of Harry Potter. It was inconvenient that the phoenix had destroyed its eyes, but not an insurmountable problem. Tom would still find uses for the basilisk, even blind. Tom walked over to the still figure of Ginny Weasley. He touched her lifeless body with his foot and felt the impact throughout his body. The transformation was complete. So nice to be able to have form and feeling again. Tom planned to make so much better use of his body than the silly girl ever would have done with hers. Tom reached down and removed the journal from Ginny's cooling fingers. She would have no use for it ever again, he thought dispassionately. The girl and the journal had both served their purpose. The basilisk would feed well tonight, Tom decided. A sudden scraping and rustle caused Tom to jerk around at the noise. "Who's there?" he demanded, pointing his wand at the cavern wall. There was no response. Tom aimed his wand with purpose at the rubble near the wall and said, "Omnium Revelio." Suddenly the scraping sound increased, and a small shape swiftly grew larger and larger until a man was revealed crouching before him. An animagus, thought Tom with interest. The man straightened briefly, revealing a pointed nose and very small, watery eyes. "Master," he said in a gravelly voice as he swiftly bent in an elaborate bow, "I come to warn you." Master, thought Tom. I like the sound of that. Tom studied the man in front of him curiously. He was a short man, rather portly, with grubby skin, thin, colorless hair, and a bald spot on the top of his head. The clothing he wore was tattered and gray. "Who are you?" asked Tom, keeping his wand pointed warily at the man. He wasn't much to look at, but had been smart enough to say the one thing that might enable him to stay alive. Tom had not intended to leave any living witnesses, but a willing servant, one who could help him get established in the wizard world. That might be useful. "Peter Pettigrew, my lord," said the man, licking his lips and rubbing his hands in hopeful anticipation. Tom noticed the man had a finger missing from one hand. "How long have you been here?" Pettigrew glanced about uncertainly, as if deciding what to say. I followed the boy, my lord," he finally said, while shifting uncomfortably. "The whole time?" "So you know who I am?" questioned Tom closely. That part hadn't been spoken, but it was a good guess that Pettigrew had been watching, too. "Yes, my lord," said Pettigrew eagerly. "That doesn't frighten you?" "Oh, no, my lord," said Pettigrew. "I am already your servant. Look!" And he pulled the sleeve up on one of his forearms to reveal some sort of a black tattoo mark. Ginny had been rather vague about the prior doings of Lord Voldemort, except for the Harry part, so Tom had no idea what the mark meant. But Pettigrew seemed to think it explained everything, and Tom had no intention of looking ignorant in front of Pettigrew. He could research the meaning of the mark later. "What is your warning?" Tom asked instead. In response, Pettigrew straightened again. "There are 2 others in the pipes, my lord," he said in a serious voice, like one of a lieutenant reporting. "They will most likely be headed this way." 2 others? And yet the Potter boy decided to come here alone? Interesting. "Would you, like me to take care of them, my lord?" asked Pettigrew hesitantly. There was a cold, calculating look in his eyes. Take care of them or join them? Tom silently wondered, while suddenly glad he had already collected his journal. He decided to hide it securely away from Pettigrew's beady eyes at the first opportunity. Pettigrew appeared to be a survivor, one who would do whatever was necessary to stay alive. Clearly, he was not above considering murder. In addition, Tom was well aware that professed loyalty to Lord Voldemort did not necessarily mean loyalty to himself. Aloud, Tom asked, "How?" It would be 2 against 1, and Peter appeared wandless. Pettigrew cast a brief, longing glance at the wand in Tom's hand, confirmation that he had no wand of his own, before responding. "They are wandless," he began. "The elder is mind-befuddled by a memory charm, and scarce knows where he is, let alone able to defend himself." "And the other?" inquired Tom curiously. "The other is a boy," replied Pettigrew flatly, his watery eyes growing blank in reflection. "Harry's age. I can overpower him easily." "Boy?" thought Tom with interest. "Who?" he asked. Jenny had mentioned some of the students. Perhaps she had mentioned this would-be rescuer. Pettigrew's eyes narrowed. "Ron Weasley," he answered calmly. "Her brother," he added without emotion, while glancing down at Jenny's still form. "Brother? Of course. He was a good friend of Harry Potter. That made a lot of sense. Jenny said they were always together. It also explained the lack of wands, in part. Jenny had mentioned that Ron's wand was broken. Tom looked down upon Jenny while he considered the situation. Ron was supposed to have red hair, like Jenny. A lock of red hair might make a suitable souvenir, he mused, staring at Jenny's long red hair. Perhaps 2 locks, one long and one short. Tom looked up at the short man. "I think I can take care of them myself," he told Pettigrew confidently. "I have something else in mind I'd like you to do." "Yes, master?" said Pettigrew eagerly, too eagerly. Pettigrew would bear watching at all times. "A small heart-shaped plaque was removed from the wall at King's Cross Station," Tom began. "Yes?" "It was placed on the Muggle side of the station at the beginning of the winter holiday and was removed before the holiday ended." "Yes?" "I want you to find out who took it," said Tom simply. The order would keep Pettigrew busy while Tom finished up at the school. It was no big deal if Pettigrew failed, and would give Tom an excuse to kill Pettigrew at his leisure later. "Bring me that name," continued Tom, "and then we'll consider how you might serve me further." If Pettigrew succeeded, then Tom would have the name of his next target, his next victim. No one could be permitted to interfere with his creations without severe consequences. "Yes, master," and Pettigrew turned to leave. "Pettigrew?" spoke Tom, reaching into his back pocket. Pettigrew turned back with a fearful look on his face. "Yes?" "Here." Tom tossed Jenny's wand in Pettigrew's direction. He had had her wand all along, intending to use it against Harry if necessary. But when Harry thoughtlessly dropped his own wand, Tom had decided it was much more satisfying to defeat Potter using Harry's own wand against him. "Thank you, master," replied Pettigrew gratefully, as his long fingers and even longer dirty fingernails curled around the wand. His face lit up in delight as he examined the slender stick. By accepting Jenny's wand, they had become partners in crime, so to speak. It would help ensure Pettigrew's silence on this and other matters. "I want no one to learn of your inquiries," instructed Tom. "No one. Do you understand?" "Yes, master," replied Pettigrew with renewed enthusiasm and a gleam in his beady eyes. He opened his mouth and put the wand between his long yellow teeth, clamped down securely, and began to shrink. Tom watched in amazement as a gray rat carrying a wand in its mouth scurried through a hole in the wall. Pettigrew might be very useful indeed. Tom considered his next move carefully as he bent down to take a lock of Jenny's long red hair. He needed to identify and eliminate as many of Lord Voldemort's enemies as possible. He wanted to do it now, while they were unwary and unsuspecting. Such persons represented a threat to Tom's own existence as well. And then Tom would seek out and assist in the revival of Lord Voldemort himself. Unlike those who believed Harry had defeated Lord Voldemort 11 years earlier, Tom knew otherwise. Tom could sense the Dark Lord's shadowy presence with every fiber of his newly created body. Though Tom was not sure he wanted to share power with the Dark Lord, Tom knew Lord Voldemort's abilities, along with Tom's, would be necessary to defeat Dumbledore, and Tom would never be safe while Dumbledore lived. After that, who knew? Back to the present. The tree trunk outside the Dursley home began to swell and get thicker again. Suddenly it vanished altogether, and Holly found herself looking at an uninterrupted view of an empty street. The rumbling thunder stopped. The flickering daylight steadied into a murky gray, and the tall grass quit shriveling, remaining tall and uncut. But the tree did not return. All that remained of the tree was a smooth, round tree stump cut level with the ground. Holly stared at the empty space in disbelief. What had happened to the tree? Slowly, Holly sank to her knees. "No," she moaned. Her hands clenched up into fists, and she pounded the ground angrily. "No, no, 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 no," she kept on saying as she beat the ground in time with her words. Eventually, Holly tired, and the pounding stopped. She remained alone, kneeling on the ground, cradled her head in her arms, and began to sob.